So welcome along. This is In Conservation with, I'm David Lindo, and it's really nice to have you all here tonight. My guest tonight is a gentleman, a very traveled gentleman who goes by the name of Chris Leahy. Now, I was talking with Chris earlier because his name to me seems like it should be Leahy, because I'm an honorary Irishman and I kind of feel that there's an Irish element in there, but please put me straight.
Well,
welcome Chris, by the way.
Thanks very much, David. I'm delighted to be here. I'm looking forward to this. Well, it's kind of a culture war or something like that. If you'd asked my paternal grandmother, who was pretty much definitely an Irish descendant, but she grew up in an era in the US where the Irish were not greatly appreciated. So she preferred the name to have it pronounced Leahy, which she perceived as English. But in general here, Leahy is pronounced Leahy. A third opinion on that was given my first career until my late 20s, although I've always been interested in birds and birding and everything. Yeah. And writing and stuff, was in the theater. And I had a friend, I was working at the Delacorte Theater in New York, Shakespeare in the Park. And one of my fellow actors, who was a Brit, said, well, actually, it should be pronounced Leahy. So he kind of made a hybrid name out of it or whatever. So, but Leahy is generally what I go by, so.
Well, at least your first name is not too difficult to go.
That's right. Wrong. That's right. Oh, and I guess another element, since we're on my name, that should be mentioned is that my middle name is Wren, because on my mother's side, theoretically at least, I've never really gone into proving this, we're related back there to the British architect Christopher Wren. So totally coincidentally, I end up with a bird name as my middle name. So
fantastic.
Oh, yes.
So, Chris, I mean, your credentials read for quite a long while. I mean, you retired in 2017 after a 45-year career as a professional conservationist with the Massachusetts Audubon Society. And you also, for 16 years, the director of the Massachusetts Audubon Center for Biological Conservation. And you have a very comprehensive interest in natural history. You're not only recognized as an authority on birds, but also insects. And you've written a whole slew of natural history books, and they've been very popular, and they owe their popularity to your ability to describe the living world with clarity and wit. And I would agree with that, as if I was a judge, but yeah, I totally, because basically your latest book, which is what we're kind of be basing this talk on, this conversation, is Birdpedia, which is a lot of interesting facts and points about birds. But before we even talk about those things, you're a traveled man, because I remember when we had a preliminary chat, I was quite surprised by the numbers of countries you've been to and the work you do in various countries. But I was most interested in Mongolia. And I believe you've written perhaps the only field guide to Mongolia's birds.
It's generally thought to be the first. There are a couple of smaller books that have been done in Mongolia, and Mongolia is sometimes marginally included in some broader Asian books, but this is basically the first definitive field guide on the birds of Mongolia, and it's one of the Helm guides. And as I'm sure you and your audience knows, that Helm has this deal with Princeton University Press, so that Helm will publish a given guide, and they've published guides to birds all over the world, and then Princeton publishes it in the US. And so I think about 2 years ago now, we brought out this guide to the birds of Mongolia, and I, of course, give full credit to my co-author. He's actually the senior author, who is a Mongolian scientist and colleague, wonderful guy. So we worked very closely together. It was one of these projects that went on and on, not because of him or me really, but there were just a lot of complications with another co-author who didn't do his job and all that kind of stuff, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it finally came out a couple of years ago, and people have been pleased with it. The British, British Birds and other British publications have been very kind to it. I had it had just come out when I was at British Bird Fair, again, 2 years ago. And people were coming by. I was there representing the Mongolians, basically, as I've done a number of times. And so it was very apropos that this book had just come out, and people kept, Brits especially, kept stopping at the desk and saying, "I'm so glad this is finally out. I've been wanting to go to Mongolia for years, but there was no really good guide. And so, thank you. So then, of course, COVID hit, and tourism, global tourism in general, has sort of declined a good deal. But hopefully, we'll get back on track, and so it'll be great fun to be leading trips again in Mongolia with this guide. So anyway.
Well, you got a copy with you. Can we have a quick look?
Yeah, of course. So I don't know if you can see that. I've got this meeting recorded screen. Are you seeing that as well? Because
if you just click accept or whatever it says.
Okay. Well, I just didn't want to take us back to some previous place. Okay, there we go.
That's all good.
That sometimes happens. Okay, so there it is. There's the title backwards, and I don't know if you can see the illustration.
Yeah. If you pull back,
that's
a Plex ground jay.
Yes, that's Mongolian, or formerly called Henderson's ground jay.
Okay.
That was kind of an interesting story, because I think it's quite nice. We picked it for the cover because it's very emblematic of Mongolia, but the first rendering of it was terrible. Obviously, the person who had done it, the colors were all right, whatever, but they'd never seen the bird, and so the posture was totally wrong, and just wasn't right. And I said, "Can we change this? Whatever." And at first, they said, Bloomsbury Press, they said no. But we kept badgering them, kind of, and we kind of let it alone for a while. And then I said, "Look, we really got to change this cover." And they kind of said, "Well, okay, if you want to pay for it." So we did. We paid for it, and I'm so glad we did, because if somebody who was familiar with the bird, or even from another field guide, had seen the earlier one, it would be like, "What's that?" And it wouldn't have been a very good first impression. So anyway,
yeah, exactly.
Little publishing story.
Interestingly about that species, I've never seen ground jays, but I've heard that they have found that they're actually more closely related to tits than they are to crows. Is that right?
Well, that's one theory. As you no doubt know, bird taxonomy in general, is in, I won't call it disarray, but it's undergoing a metamorphosis of sorts. And so splitting, as we call it, I believe I may have an entry on splitting, or lumping and splitting, or something, has become the rage. And of course, with genetic work, DNA work, there are all kinds of connections that we wouldn't have guessed at. Certainly, if you watch a ground jay in action, it suggests a jay more than a tit, but it could suggest other groups as well. It's very much a cursorial bird, to use a technical term, sort of running around the Gobi Desert and feeding mainly on ants. And they're just wonderful birds of personality, very attractive in a number of levels.
That's a good word, cursorial.
What's that? Cursorial. It just means, like cream-colored courser. Yeah, coursing. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're here to talk about about this book, I suppose. This is your latest, Birdpedia, a brief compendium of avian lore. And I've been thumbing through this, and I just think, when I saw that book, before I knew you, I thought we must have this man on to talk about stuff about birds, just have a general chat about birds. We started off talking about names, and I'm really quite interested in names. I'm a bit of a stickler, actually, because there's several things. I've just finished writing a children's encyclopedia on birds, and one of the things is going into the American market, and the American editor came back with a few questions, and fair enough. And obviously things like diver were changed to loon, and Slavonian grebe, which we call it over here in Europe, is now, well, is eared grebe over where you are. But there was this thing regarding feral pigeon, and she came back saying that she wanted to call it common city pigeon. And I was up in arms. I said, you can't do that. That is ridiculous. That is not a name. You know, you look at any of the American field guides, it's written as rock dove or rock pigeon. I mean, at a stretch, maybe street pigeon, but common city pigeon, I just could not abide by. What are your thoughts regarding names of birds? I mean, in America, for example, you know, you got hawks, which we would call buzzards over here in the old world,
right.
You know, and your vultures you call buzzards, and the hawks that should be hawks, like the accipiters, are called hawks. But why? What do you think? I mean, do you think the American robin should really be renamed as the red-breasted thrush or American thrush even?
Yeah, well, I actually think it's very interesting, and I'm not particularly up in arms about getting everybody with exactly the same vernacular name kind of thing. And I think it's fascinating that so many of our birds, and you mentioned robin, came from, you know, the colonists who came here and said, oh, look at that big red-breasted bird, what should we call it? And they said, oh, well, it's quite like a robin, isn't it? So we call it American robin, you know, and even though, you know, different genus, they really, you know, the Eurasian robin doesn't look much like ours, and the color is different and all of that. But it's an interesting cultural link, and it's an interesting story from my point of view. I mean, here we are sort of talking about it. And of course, there are many examples like that. And you've mentioned a couple others. The other songbird I think of is redstart, okay? So there's a Eurasian chat called redstart, and there are a bunch of different redstarts. But again, presumably someone, an early colonist who had an interest in natural history, looked at this wood warbler, which again looks nothing like a Eurasian redstart as far as I'm concerned, but it has red in the tail. Start means tail, in fact, if you go back to root names. So, you know, we have American redstart, and I think that's all, you know, quite interesting. The other thing that I think is interesting about it is that robin, for example, is like a lot of old world British names and things are folk names. You know, it's Robin Redbreast, and magpie is Maggie the Pie, and jackdaw is Jack the Daw. And so there's that piece of history as well. And the fact that the name finch originates from the call, and this goes way back, but that name for various seed-eating birds goes back to the call of chaffinch. And if you know your chaffinch call, you'll know that it does kind of sound like think, think, or pink, pink, or something like that. And so that's where these words come from. So I'm an English major. I don't have a PhD in science. My degrees are in you know, like English literature and things like that. And so all that, I find all that fascinating. And you know, you mentioned the vulture, the whole vulture thing. And again, you can see how people saw this kind of large soaring bird that fed on carrion and associated it with the old world vultures. Even though they're not related. The interesting thing, an additional interesting thing about that one is that, again, recent taxonomic DNA kind of stuff has convinced us that not only are our New World vultures, turkey vulture, black vulture, the condors, et cetera, not only are they not related to the Old World vultures, they're not raptors at all. They're related. They're most closely related to storks. And one of the fascinating ways that this was intuited before it was proven by DNA is that among the various characteristics, anatomical characteristics and behavioral characteristics that turkey vultures or the New World vultures have in common with storks is that they both have a unique cooling mechanism, which is to defecate on their feet. So that kind of thing. And I just think that's, I don't know if wonderful is the word, but interesting.
But the thing is, I mean, I'm a bit of a stickler, as I mentioned right at the very beginning. I feel that everyone should fall into line. It should be in international names.
Uh-huh.
And I've come across this whilst working on this children's book, because the excuse me, the American editor came to me, and look, she mentioned some very good points. I mean, for example, common blackbird, which in Britain is just called blackbird, and obviously in Germany and Spain it's different names. But as far as I'm concerned, the official international name is common blackbird, and the reason why it's called common blackbird and not Eurasian blackbird, as was suggested to me, is because it's found in North Africa, Asia, into the Middle East as well. It's found outside of Eurasia.
Yeah.
And I think to myself, well, there should be at least one list whereby, everyone adheres to,
Yeah, and I tend to agree with that, basically, contrary to what I may have given the impression of. But I think that there's a difference between, but I should ask you, but would you approve of saying, instead of banishing American robin and calling it red-breasted thrush? Or would you keep American robin?
Well, I'm quite brutal. I'd say let's go for red-breasted thrush.
Okay.
Let's go for clay-colored thrush instead of clay-colored robin. I would have a clean sweep. But then you're right. Then you have this problem where you come to things like loons, for example. I personally dislike the name loon,
Right.
because I think it's disrespectful. I know it's named after the call and that sort of stuff, but I think diver says what it does in the tin, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
So why can't they be called, instead of common loon, the Great Northern Diver?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that all of that was fought over by a committee of ornithologists and nomenclatural folks, and I think it's I can't imagine it will ever be totally sort of resolved. But so part of my brain says, yes, David is absolutely right. We should have consistent list of common names, and I actually totally agree with that. What those names are, and what I would be kind of loath to give up, is things like we have a bird that is it's basically in the New World blackbird family. So here we have another one of those ambiguities, blackbird, called a bobolink. And if you looked at it, you would never guess it was related to a grackle or a red-winged blackbird or whatever. It's a beautiful bird. The males are beautiful bird, all black and white, and with a big sort of peach-colored nape, etc. And they have a wonderful song, which is where the name comes from. Partly, it also comes another folk name. It comes from Bobbling, but in any case, and I would be loath to change Bobbling, such a wonderful name and so evocative of so many things, to yellow naped blackbird or something like that. So my brain is half and half on that.
It's interesting about Bobbling, because I think that song, which is, if you haven't heard it, you must listen to it online. It was basically what they used to base R2-D2 on Star Wars on.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know that.
If you listen to it, it sounds like the squeaking of R2, exactly the same.
Yes, no, I get that. Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah. One of our loyal people, Zoomers here, Jim Wright, has raised a very good point, actually, and that is, even though we have all these different names, and some of them are colloquial names, and you've written about it in your book about colloquial names, which we'll maybe touch on in a minute, but they all have the same Latin name, which is universal. So maybe that's the end of the argument, really, isn't it?
Well, that always has tended to try to be the end of the argument, that vernacular names, common names, are for common usage, and if there's any confusion, you look at the scientific name. So, and that's a point of view. But I also tilt to your point of view a bit, that there should be some, there should be some agreement on common names. Although I think there'll always be a kind of a resentment, that you don't want to call Slavonian grebe horned grebe, and we don't want to call common loon, great northern diver, and that's probably not going to change. But anyway.
It's interesting. The other day, I was interviewed by German radio, a radio station in Germany, and they were asking me to comment on some bird names that have links with dubious past, i.e., links with people who were slave traders and things like that. And it's quite interesting because I actually said, to be honest, like, I think one of the birds is McCowan's longspur. Is that? Yes. I think that's one of the contentious names. And I was thinking, well, I've always known it as McCowan's longspur. And although I've only recently found out that guy, was a slave trader or, whatever he did, that I don't know how to feel about that, because I think to myself, it doesn't mean that much to me. But then if you live in North America, and if you even though I'm descendant of slave myself, but I'm kind of once removed because I'm in Europe, so I'm not actually walking the same earth that stuff happened in America. So it kind of opened up a whole different sort of feeling for me. But one thing I did sort of think about and mention at the time was that I felt that there was a lack of bird names or even wildlife in general that reflected non-white people or non-white scientists. And I put that on Twitter the other day, and people came back and said, well, what about, and they mentioned a couple of Chinese names, which was fair enough. But how do you feel about that? How did you feel when that all kicked off?
I think we're pretty much in sync on that. I mean, I agree that ideally there would be more bird names, with people's names associated with them that were, from Black scientists, Asian scientists, whatever. On the other hand, I think there is it also matters a bit to me what the context was. And I'm not sure I can't recall it exactly with McCowan, but I don't think it wasn't as anybody was particularly honoring him necessarily. It was I think he was one of that. There was a whole group of people that were, when the railroads were being built across North America, who were either physicians or other things. And there were many new birds discovered along the way. And there were a few key people who were responsible for, naming things. And so some of them were a little bit random. And so that's part of it. But I also think, for example, there's a movement here to, abolish Audubon. Audubon's, Audubon's warbler is now demoted to a subspecies or whatever, but he's lost a lot of his names, but there's still Auduboni in the Latin name. And there's a move to sort of change that. And again, I'm thinking, are we going to, I'm all for removing statues of, Confederate generals and things. I mean, they were traitor to the country as far as I'm concerned, although that's going to be controversial, I guess, but that is everyone who in any way was connected to slavery or owned some slaves, but did other very worthwhile things in their lives, are we just to kind of push them aside? And that makes me uncomfortable, while acknowledging that yes, that in no way endorses the practice of slavery or any of that. So one of the things I've tried to do with this, you may know or not, that this book comes from a number of years ago. I wrote a much larger book called The Birdwatcher's Companion to North American Bird Life, and the latest edition, which was also published by Princeton in 2004, I think, is like 1,000 pages, and it's also an alphabetical work, but it intends to be comprehensive, as 1,000 pages tends to imply. and scientifically based and all that. But I also, my attention, as with this current book, was to make it very readable. And apparently that was successful. At least that's what I hear from people. But that again is one of the things I've tried to do with this new book. Again, that was Birdwatcher's Companion to North American Birds. Now, there are a lot of essays in that book and in this book that apply worldwide. Articles on migration, feeding habits, vision, you name it, would be comprehensible and recognizable and familiar to people anywhere. But it did, exclude people from other countries in a prominent way. So I've tried to add in a few of those. For example, an early entry on the A's is the famous Indian ornithologist Salim Ali, a wonderful man who I had the great privilege of meeting when he was still alive, et cetera. And to do a number of things like that to broaden the, what shall I call it, the cultural base of the book. It's a very small book, so what those are they're not huge, but I've made an effort to do that. So,
talking about the ornithologists you've mentioned in the book, I mean, obviously you've spoken about Audubon, James Audubon, and Wilson. Who in your opinion were the notable ornithologists from the past? Who do you actually kind of look up to and think, yeah, he was or she was? In fact, it's more likely to be he, but anyway, who do you kind of rate personally?
Well, again, as with birds, there are different categories, kind of thing. I think people like, well, let's say, the ornithologist, and I describe it this way, who I would most like to have met, perhaps aside from Audubon. Audubon was a really interesting guy. He was born of his father's French housemaid mistress when his father had a plantation in what's now the Dominican Republic, and was then Saint-Dominique, where there were many slaves, and his father certainly owned some, but it was like a sugar plantation or something of that kind. But his father, to his credit, I guess, raised him as his son, and eventually adopted him and gave him a French name, Jean-Jacques Audubon. And when they returned to France, because from a number of things, there was a slave rebellion in what's now Haiti. So they had to get their buns out of there. But also it was time of Napoleonic Wars. This was a time of tremendous upheaval in France. So they're going back to France right into, the times of the storming of the Bastille and all of that. And one of the fears with Jean-Jacques was that he would be drafted into Napoleon's army if he didn't get out of there. And so his father had started a business in the New World, and Audubon near Philadelphia, and Audubon went to Philadelphia to try to make it in business, which he utterly failed at several times, partly his own fault, but partly, historical circumstances. And the other thing his father did when he was educating Audubon in France was he gave him all the accoutrements of a gentleman. He was taught to play violin, I believe, to be a good fencer, and to draw. And his father was interested in natural history and encouraged him to draw birds and mammals or whatever, blah, blah, blah. That's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the interest of Audubon and how he got interested in doing this immense work to try to illustrate all of the birds of North America, full size in the great elephant folio. So, I mean, he and his journals, he was also a wonderfully colorful writer. So his journals are wonderful and filled with adventures. He's walking from, Kentucky to Ohio or something, walking with his shotgun for collecting birds, et cetera, in his paint box. And he gets robbed, or he meets highwaymen, or just endless sort of adventures. So I guess I would pick him out as one of it's probably the person that I would pick out that I would most want to meet. The other person that stands out for me is a man named Elliot Cowes, Coues. And he was a very prolific writer on ornithology. He was a serious scientist ornithologist, but he's also always described as one of the most interesting of any of these features, that he was apparently a great wit, a great raconteur. And if you read his work, if you read his, Cowes' Key to North American Birds, which again, talk about a fat tome, especially the introductory parts, he talks about what a good, how you should approach, modern, in his terms, ornithology, and how, a good collector would, he talked about, how to clean your shotgun and how to get all you can get in a day in the field and that kind of thing. Just a very colorful, as well as a highly accomplished individual. So he'd be another person that I'd certainly single out. If you look again at, some of that 19th century, mid-19th century people that worked in connection with the railroad and all that, there are many people like, Robert Ridgway and things, who are also made great contributions to American ornithology. And then here in Massachusetts, one of our local ornithological heroes is William Brewster, who was not just an ornithologist, but a great naturalist and conservationist. And actually, Mass Audubon is currently sort of restoring and moving staff into his estate in Concord. So anyway, lots of interesting ornithological people to admire. Going back a little bit to our previous conversation, one of the other lacks, in addition to cultural diversity, ethnic diversity within bird names and ornithology, are women. And so again, I've tried to include a number of female figures, people like Rachel Carson and a number of others, Florence Bailey and whatever. One of the most interesting ones to me is a woman named Eleonora of Arborea. And Arborea was, if I'm remembering this right, it's in the book, was a district in Sardinia, okay? And through an interesting coincidences of who died when and all that, she became the sort of, duchess, if you will, of this given province. And she was the first woman, and this goes back to, I believe, the 1400s. She was the first woman to, and maybe the first person to actually create a law protecting birds and birds' nests, which was like, when I found that one out, that sort of blew me away. And the reason was she didn't just have a dream about that. Her family, like a lot of noble families at the time, were big into falconry. And so she had a concern for protecting those birds, and she expanded it to other birds as well. And of course, she is commemorated in Eleonora's falcon, which is a wonderful, I'm sure wonderful sort of Mediterranean area falcon, breeds on cliffs and things like that. So that's again another factor that considered.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's not a huge amount of birds in particular named after women when you think about it, and often they're named in honor of women as opposed to being named by the women that found them.
Correct.
Or so for example, in Europe we've got Thekela's lark, which was named after a German ornithologist's daughter who died of heart disease or something. And then there's some great ones like Mrs. Hume's pheasant,
yes,
and things like that. But
yes. And Blackburnian warbler here is named for Anne Blackburn. But again, sort of honoring her as a person, not as you know, an order as a specialist or anything. So
yeah. Do you think in 100 years' time, when people look back at this generation of ornithologists and birders and naturalists and conservationists, will there be some great names, do you think? Or do you think it would always be, you know, Audubon and all those guys? For example, would you think that they'll be revering David Attenborough, for example?
What was they were what? What was the last one?
You think they'd be revering David Attenborough?
Oh, I suppose. I mean, one of the things that influences that is that we are, even though that we're in an era of splitting, we may be, at least in the bird line, we may be, and it's running out of new birds, if you know what I mean. I certainly think David Attenborough would be worthy and of that kind of recognition. I'm also familiar with the phenomenon happening now that, again, with the splitting, we're discovering, not so much discovering new species at that level, although that hasn't stopped completely, but we're discovering new subspecies also called all the time, especially when we investigate various island groups and things like that. I mean, we're all aware that scops owls, for example, there's a scops owl subspecies like pretty much everywhere, it seems like. And recent anecdotes of people, you know, business people who are interested in birds, are passionate bird watchers, twitchers perhaps mainly, but and travel the world and get taken around by various knowledgeable people and whatever. And I know of a couple of cases in which, because of their funding of given scientific work or certain expeditions, they get, say, a scops owl named after them. So in the trinomial, you know, it may be, you know, Otis Scops, you know, Lindo or whatever it is, you know, and the reason for that is that, you know, basically it was paid for. And I don't particularly object to that. I think, you know, the fact that they've funded good and legitimate research is legitimate, but it's an interesting twist on how birds are named. But I think most of the people like David Attenborough who distinguished scientists and naturalists and whatever, they may have to content themselves, at least as far as birds are concerned, with a subspecies name. Insects is a different question, so there's still a lot of those to discover. So
your book I found very interesting because there's lots of little sort of nuggets in there which I've never really kind of given much thought. One thing I read about was body odor, and it made me suddenly think, but you know, when you're catching birds in mist nets, they have a certain smell, and it's something that maybe most people don't actually even think about. So can you expand on your body odor? No, not your body odor.
Yeah, not a great deal. There are actually a couple of subjects there, but yes, the one that you're obviously focusing on is, and I'm interested to hear you say that, because I think a lot of people, well, of course, a lot of people don't come in very close contact with birds as somebody who's ringing or banding, as you have and I have and whatever. So they don't have really an opportunity to smell a bird, so to speak. And I know a lot of bird banders, and I've asked them this, you know, it's like, well, do you ever notice any smell? And a lot of them say, no, they don't really have a smell. And I've always detected, yes, it's mild and subtle in some cases, but yes, definitely do have. Some of it comes from some of the more perceptive ringers have noticed that birds that migrate through cities, for example, will have an odor of you know, city smoke or other toxins or things like that. And they also may have an odor of something they've been feeding on, or, you know, some other environmental thing. But I always think that most birds have a subtle, I don't know quite how to describe it. It's a mild and sort of pleasant smell, not perfumey at all, but kind of I don't know, natural or something. And then one of the anecdotes in the book, and I'm going to forget the name now, but one ornithologist has pointed out that one of the auklets, I forget which one, apparently the appendages, the fleshy appendages on the face have the smell of tangerine oranges, he says. So there's little things like that. And I think the subject that you just mentioned probably could bear a lot more scrutiny. The other thing that it suggests is that there's, you know, how birds smell to us, but then there is the bird's sense of smell. And like a lot of the bird's senses, sense of smell was long underestimated. You know, it's like, oh no, birds see pretty well, but they have very little sense of smell, very little sense of taste. Their hearing is very sort of limited, blah, blah. Well, the more we find out, and their intelligence, very low. The more we find out, the more we do research, the more we find that actually a lot of these senses are a lot keener than we were led to believe previously, probably out of just prejudice. Well, it's just a bird; it can't have much going for it, and but there are things like the storm petrels, for example, and all of the so-called tube-nosed pelagic birds have an excellent sense of smell, to the extent that, and this is particularly true, so that they can detect the essence of krill, for example, miles away on the ocean, and find their way to that source of food. And a lot of them also depend on smell in order to, a lot of these birds are cavity nesters on remote islands, and are mainly active at the nest at night. Okay, so these birds have to find a tiny hole stuck in the vegetation on a remote island, in darkness. How do they do that? Sense of smell. They can detect not only the general storm petrel smell, but they can detect the smell of their own nest, so to speak. So that bespeaks obviously a very acute sense of smell. And it's been also found recently that they also that other birds can also have a fairly keen sense of smell in terms of finding food, other food sources, fruits and things like that. So we keep learning stuff.
Yeah, because I was reading a while ago about turkey vultures and lesser yellow-headed vulture, the fact that they have a keen sense of smell, whereas the black vulture, or the American black vulture, hasn't. Is that right?
Yes, I believe that's the case. I'm not. There's a famous dispute, again, as we were speaking about Audubon, about that, and he claimed that he was investigating this idea, and he did a painting of some carrion, and he had an actual corpse of some kind nearby, which he covered up. And he claimed that his experiment proved that the vulture was more attracted to his painting of carrion than it was to the smell. But that's since been disputed, and I believe we now know that yes, turkey vultures, do indeed find their food in part by smell, but also by sight. The black vulture part, I'm not so clear on, but I'm sure you're right.
Let's talk about singing.
Okay.
A popular question I'm always asked about singing: why do birds sing? And the classic thing is to ward off other males and to attract females and basically mark out territory. You and I were talking the other day, and you told me about birds that sang on a nest. Now, I actually hadn't come across that. Can you explain about that?
I can't really explain it. It seems counterintuitive, even though the facts are clear. I mean, for example, rose-breasted grosbeaks females and other finches, other members of the finch family, though not all, will sing on the nest, which again, they are cryptically colored. They're cryptically colored to be less conspicuous as they brood their eggs. And so it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense that they're sitting there singing, which would seem to be an obvious attractant to predators. And I have no explanation for that, and did not try to give one in the book. So there are anomalies like that. But in general, song is the male's province for the most part. Sometimes during the breeding season, and again with certain species, the females will sing, especially sort of more subtle songs, and these more conspicuous songs of the males. As you point out, there are two, fundamental dual rationales for song. One is, again, attracting a mate. Here I am, come and get me, kind of thing. Don't I sing pretty? And then there's also the defensive piece of sort of defining territory and saying to other males of the same species, this is mine, baby, you stay over there. And I see that right in my yard here in Eastern Massachusetts. We have one of our fairly recent arrivals from the South, probably due to climate change to a certain extent, is Carolina wren. And they have a very loud, quite pretty, brief, but very loud, like a lot of birds that sing out of dense habitats. And I can hear 4 different Carolina wrens from my yard, and it's very clear, okay, that's his territory over there, and this one's his, and this one's someone else's, kind of thing. So that's another very conspicuous part of what bird song is all about.
Talking about nesting, you might not be able to answer this question, and maybe no one can answer this question, but one question I'm always sort of asked about is, why do birds like cuckoos and cowbirds, why do they forego the formalities of raising young themselves and put it upon someone else to do? What's the benefit?
Well, I think I would say the benefits, obvious. It's like all they have to do is do a little finagling to distract the host, so to speak, so that the female can get in there and lay her eggs, and then they're out of there. And so I think there's a clear benefit to sort of energetics, if you wanted to call it that. They can probably parasitize many more birds than the other. It allows them to do their trick a number of times. But I think it's basically a labor-saving device, if you will. And of course, many different species of birds have many different reactions to that. Some birds recognize what's going on and kick the egg or the chick or whatever out. Other birds will rear the young along with their own young. I believe our yellow warbler does that, so that they can rear both a cowbird chick and at least one or two of their own species. And then, of course, things like the Eurasian cuckoo, to a lesser extent, the New World cuckoos, which are now in a different family, but where the cuckoo, greatly is much larger than most of its parasitic, most of its host species. And yet, we've all seen pictures. I think there's one in the book, actually, of, I don't know, a whitethroat or something that looks like it could jump in the gape of the young cuckoo that it's dropping a bug into its mouth. So there's quite a lot of variation. What always fascinates me, there's so many interesting details about brood parasitism, because it's evolved many different times. But it's wonderful that, in one sense, that the cuckoos, that the parasite cuckoo, not only that certain cuckoos specialize in certain songbirds to parasitize, and they mimic things like the gape design, etc., so that it's not just some anonymous bird, but they have these clues that the wren will recognize. Oh yeah, it may be big, but it's a wren, okay, stuff like that. So very interesting.
Yeah, it's amazing, and it's also quite interesting to think that it's not just limited or confined to cuckoos and cowbirds. There's a duck, isn't there? I can't remember what duck it is, but there's a duck that does that as well.
Yes, and there's a common practice of not just one species. What is it? Yeah, I'm trying to think too. Is it ruddy duck?
No, I
I don't
think
know.
it's some blue-billed duck or musk duck or something. I can't remember what it
Yeah,
is.
yeah, it's not coming to me. It's in the book. um, but yes, and there are other ducks that are not. They don't do that as a single strategy, but they'll put a few eggs in another bird's nest. Ducks, characteristically, anatids of ducks and geese, characteristically lay lots of eggs, and a lot of the eggs look pretty similar between species, and so ducks will dump a few of their own eggs in somebody else's nest and let them rear them, and also have their own nest, kind of. So lots of different strategies, kind of thing. There's also something called a dump nest, which is where a duck, or this is also common among the South American rhea, the big ostrich-like bird in South America, where other birds characteristically will lay their eggs in one particular female rhea's nest. But after a while, sometimes they build up, so there may be 30 or 40 eggs, and the female will go, "Oh, forget it. I'm not brooding all those eggs. I'll take a few extras, but no." So different dodges.
It's interesting. Again, going back to names. I mean, you call it the rhea, and I call it the rhea, and Sabine gull, Sabine gull. It's really fascinating.
Or Sabin's gull, as I'm told by some people, is the correct one. So anyway, yes.
And over in Europe, we have well, in Britain we call it Audouin's gull, but the correct pronunciation is Audouin. Audouin.
I will have to remember that. Audouin. All right.
Audouin. Yes. That's it. Well, listen, I think I think the last thing we can talk about, because the time is, we could be talking all night about your book, Birdpedia. What I was interested in was, you talked about fiction, and in terms of birds being noted in fiction, and the writer sort of having poetic license to then describe these incredible birds. And I'll take it a stage further. I mean, I'm always looking at TV and films and hearing things that should not be there. I mean, as a kid, I remember watching a lot of Westerns on the Sunday afternoon and hearing what I thought was a willow warbler in the background all the time. It turned out actually there was a house finch they were using, I think, all the time. And also, for example, Charlie's Angels, there was a scene when Boswell was locked up somewhere, incarcerated somewhere in California. No, I can't remember where he was, but basically, no, Miami or someplace in the East. And I've forgotten the name of the character, but she said, "Hear that sound? That's a pygmy nuthatch." And then the bird they depicted was an oriole, like I don't know, a Baltimore oriole or something. And that infuriated me. And Breakback Mountain, shot in, I think, Northwest Canada or someplace like that, and featured hooded crows from Eurasia. So I just find it so lazy. I think they should be consulting people like us and paying us lots of money to get it right.
Yeah, well, obviously, probably I agree. I've also noted, though, that as much as I deplore, as you just have, the wrong bird in the wrong place kind of thing, I also applaud when, on a number of occasions I've had, these are usually, PBS kind of things, where they'll be in the forest in eastern US and they'll have a wood thrush singing, and I'll think, oh, give them points for that kind of stuff. So they do get it right occasionally, but I agree with you, they often get it wrong. But you raised, I was just going to say that I'm glad you raised that, because what I say in the preface is that I say that, birds are everywhere, and that, obviously the first thing that comes to someone's mind is geography. They're all over the world. They're in the Arctic, they're in the Antarctic, they're in the desert, they're in the blah, blah. But they're also in our fiction, in our poetry, in our music, all of those things. And I've included entries for each of those things, and how relatively common birds are, and specific birds, in many works of many different authors. And I think that's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, going back to applauding TV series, I was watching Vikings on Netflix, and obviously set in Norway or Sweden or wherever, and plus Iceland and also England and Spain and other places. And to be fair, they got all the bird calls right. You know, I was hearing black woodpeckers, I was hearing all the stuff that you'd expect to find in a particular region. So I applaud the makers
That's great.
of that series. I mean, maybe the storyline is a bit weak, but at least the birds were right.
Yeah, you wonder how that came about. Was there somebody on the set, whether it was the director or a cameraman or somebody who said, wait a minute, that's not the right bird. You need to have a black woodpecker there, and something like that, or how it happened to get it right, or whether they had a consultant, you know.
I was once consulted. There's a chain of supermarkets over here in Britain called Waitrose, and they do a Christmas ad every year. And I was consulted, admittedly, down the line, not right at the very beginning. And the story was about a robin that it was time to migrate. So he left his northern forest and flew to Britain, but ran a gauntlet of different things, like being attacked by a falcon, and and then he ends up on a bird table munching on the mince pie because it's Christmas. But then when I looked at the actual film, they had the wrong calls. They had a New Zealand brown falcon attacking the robin. It was just, and I'm thinking, why can't if you have so much attention to detail to other things, why can't you just get it right here? I mean, that's my thinking. It's like James Bond. You watch James Bond movies, they got all the high-tech stuff, and then he lifts a crap pair of binoculars. And I'm thinking, why can't he get a beautiful, sexy pair, of Leicas or Swarovski binoculars? And why do you have those big sort of naval, obviously very lightweight binoculars, and when you look through, you've got an inverted figure of eights.
Yeah, well, don't you think, David, that has to do with the way birds and birding used to be generally thought of, and is now wholesomely changing a great deal, so that a lot of people would be like, who cares, what is it? It's just birds, and as far as getting the birdwatcher stuff, paraphernalia right, who cares? They're just crazy, kooky, probably rich people and whatever. And that has changed so dramatically, even just in my lifetime. When I was a kid, if you were a bird watcher rather than a soccer player or something like that, it was like, I don't know. I was a pretty gregarious kid, so that didn't really affect me too much, but it certainly did some shyer kids. And now it's like, in this country at least, it is only edged out a little bit by gardening as the most popular outdoor activity. So golf, fishing, all lose out to bird watching now. And so that's one of the things behind the idea of this Birdpedia, was that I think there's still a lot of people who go, gee, a lot of my friends are out there, looking over smelly mud flats and stuff and looking up into the trees. What is that about? And so, I encourage, birding friends to take this book, if they're cheap, good stocking stuffer, and give it to one of those people. And it would help explain what's so interesting about birds and why birds are so fascinating to people.
I would wholeheartedly agree with that. Totally. It's a great book. It's great size, very fascinating read. Now, big question for you, Chris. What's your favorite bird?
Okay. Well, it won't surprise you to hear that I've been asked that before.
Really?
And so just a little background on that. I mean, I think we all, if somebody asks you what your favorite color is, it's like a no-brainer, right? You probably know what your favorite color has been since you were a kid or something like that. And it's kind of one dimension or whatever. But for me, asking what my favorite bird is kind of like asking what my, I have all these friends and people I know and whatever, and somebody saying, well, who's your favorite friend? And it's like, well, I like John because he's this and that, and I like Mary because she's this and that. And it's like, well, who would be my favorite? And that would be multiplied over many friends and things. So for me, that's more like what looking at birds are. I've looked at birds all my life. I've traveled all over the world. I've seen probably 2/3 of the bird species in the world. Many of them wonderful, but for me, they're not just, yes, many of them have beautiful plumage. They're wonderfully attractive, but they also have amazing behaviors. They act differently, just like my friend John or my friend Mary or whatever. They do different, interesting things, many different interesting things. And they also have cultural connections in many cases, okay? And they have personal connections with my travels and things. So, okay, that's the preface. So I will now get to a couple of my favorite birds demonstrating that. So one arguably that kind of came to mind early on is the resplendent quetzal, okay? Splendid quetzal, native to southern Mexico and Central America. Beautiful bird, spectacular bird, okay? You know, bright iridescent green plumage with a bright red breast. It's the male, of course. And then these long, they say long tail, but it's really their elongated upper tail coverts that make these long sort of streamers. So the background story, though, is that back in our hippie days, my wife and I traveled all over Mexico and Central America and lived in Guatemala for a while in a VW camper and, you know, all the usual stuff, and looked at birds and other amazing things and involved in the culture and all that. And the quetzal is it's the national bird of Guatemala, but it's also has this deep heritage of all of the you know, indigenous cultures of that part of the world, embodied in this figure called Quetzalcoatl. And Quetzalcoatl is called the plumed serpent. And there are many amazing depictions of it. And it is from Quetzalcoatl that all of the indigenous nations, the Aztecs, the Toltecs, the, you know, Mayans or whatever, supposedly originated. And the plumes of the plumed serpent are those of the quetzal. So it has that sort of cultural resonance, and that's something that I look for and emphasize in my tours. You know, whenever we go birding, you know, I'm always keen to involve, you know, to talk about the local culture and all of that. So there's that sort of personal aspect. Oh, the other thing about Quetzal is that if you're leading a tour in a country where the resplendent Quetzal occurs, you must find that bird. And so it's I call it a pressure bird for the tour leader. So if it, you know, happens to be a terrible day in the Monteverde cloud forest in Costa Rica and you're having a tough time finding the quetzal, you're in big trouble, kind of stuff. So that's the other thing that makes the quetzal stand out. And I'll just give you one other example, very different, and that's this wonderful little bird called the wall creeper. It's in the nuthatch family, and not much bigger than a nuthatch, and has a decurved bill, and it spends its days crawling around on walls, on cliff faces, in remote mountain areas mostly. And the amazing thing about it, aside from those interesting habits, is that when it opens its wings, the bird in general is kind of gray. When it opens its wings, its primary and secondary feathers are bright pink and polka dotted. And so presumably this is an evolutionary trait, it's a flash trait kind of. So, okay, so the, whatever it is, the goshawk or whatever it is, comes zooming in to try to grab this wall creeper, although goshawk would be unlikely to be in that habitat. In any case, whatever raptor, a peregrine. And the bird, it looks like just a little gray bird, flashes these wings, and in that moment of hesitation, the wall creeper takes off. That's just a hopefully plausible theory. Anyway, it's a spectacular little bird. It's not particularly easy to find. They don't occur in every cliff face. And so my other connection with it, in addition to its unique look and behavior and all that, is that I saw my first one in the early 80s in Mongolia, and Mongolia is one of my favorite places in the world for a whole variety of reasons. So I have kind of roots of sorts in Mongolia. And so I make that sort of cultural connection with wall creeper as well. So those are two of my favorite birds, and I could go on and on probably, but you know, the fewer the better, right? So you wanted one, so.
The wall creeper is a great shout, beautiful bird. And briefly, if you could be anywhere on this planet right now, where would you be?
I'd be in Mongolia, because I mean, there are many amazing places that I love deeply. Argentina is one, Bhutan is another. But again, you know, in the many trips that I've designed and led and things, there are exquisitely beautiful places. And I mean, in terms of birding, you know, Colombia, Peru, etc. But Mongolia has, as I've just said, a kind of a special place in my heart. I went there in the early 80s when basically nobody was going there. It was kind of an accident. We got flown there because we were traveling around scouting the then Soviet Union. This is Brezhnev era. For doing some trips there. We were actually invited to do that, and that's a whole other story. But when we get to these places, even though we had letters of introduction from, you know, top officials in Moscow, we'd get to some of these places and the locals would be like, I don't know, who are these guys? I'm not sure I want to, you know, deal with these gringos. And so they turn us down. And of course, I was always wanting to go to mountaintops and other places where there might be radar installations and stuff. So anyway, at one point, but our in-tourist guide was with us. She liked what we were doing. So she would argue with them to give us something in return. If we can't go see the seals at Lake Baikal, you know, give them something in return. And so at one of those places, we were at Baikal actually, and one of the officials say, well, I'm sorry you cannot do this one, but how would you like to go to Mongolia? So we flew out that night on one of their DC-3s in the middle of the night, which is what you did in those days, to Mongolia. And no Americans were going to Mongolia in those days. And we looked around a bit. It was fascinating, but you couldn't do much. But I kind of kept at it, met some ornithologists there. And since then, I've just, you know, I've kind of adopted it. Wonderful people. It's still a largely nomadic herding culture. It's one of the least populated countries. It is the least densely populated country in the world, and it's an immense country, bigger than Alaska. So that it's just, you know, wilderness. And people think of Mongolia as being like, oh, the Gobi Desert and kind of brown, and there's nothing really there. Well, the Gobi itself is magnificent, but there are also high mountains, including in the Gobi, and these wonderful steppes, wonderful lakes and other wetlands teeming with migratory shorebirds. And then in the north, coniferous forests. So it's wonderfully diverse, wonderful people, and we've got some really interesting conservation projects going on there now. So that would be a fairly easy answer for me, I guess.
Okay, well, we're going to have you back to talk about Mongolia without any question of a doubt. So,
right,
great. Zoomers, watch out for that. So next, coming up next on the In Conservation with list so far, we've got Sarah Fowler on Monday the 25th, and she's chatting about sharks. She's written a book on the sharks of the world. Ben Hoare, who's a writer, he's going to be with us on Wednesday the 27th of October, talking about wild cities. He's written a book of that same title, talking about the wildlife that occurs in the unusual wildlife that occurs in cities around the world. And on Monday, the 1st of November, we got Amy Jane Beer, and she's written a book called A Tree a Day, and we'll be finding out exactly what that means. And so far, the final one so far, but it's going to be more, don't worry. John Dunn on Monday, the 15th of November, he's going to be talking about hummingbirds, and he's written a book called The Glitter in the Green. So we'll be hearing about his quest for hummingbirds. So it leads me to say a massive thank you, Chris, for being here today to talk to us about your book, Birdpedia, which is out now. And great read, good Christmas stocking filler, as you said. Thank you very much for your time. We're going to definitely have you back. And yes, thank you.
Well, thank you, David. It's been great fun, and you're very tolerant to let me babble away about my book. So, and I'll look forward to coming back and babbling some more about Mongolia. So.
Absolutely. And Zoomers, thank you very much for being with us tonight, and looking forward to seeing you again. And don't forget, keep looking up.